Time glitches are a commonly reported phenomenon, and time slips are a phenomenon that causes unexpected time travel. The following two unusual stories were either a time slip or a time glitch. Village from the past. In 1993, Alf and Eileen Roberts were on holiday in southwest England and had been staying at a hotel in Dunster in Somerset. They decided to drive down to Devon for the day, and shortly before heading back to their hotel around 7:30 p.m. in the evening, they realised they were lost and suddenly found themselves in a village that they had not previously visited. They decided to pull over to the side of the road at the top of the village and check the map for directions. But then something caught their attention. As I looked across at a small park, I noticed a polished wooden sign that said Best Kept Village in Bampton, 1976. The wooden sign on the green was surrounded by old buildings with window boxes, and everything was surrounded by beautiful flowers and flower baskets where everything was a blaze of colour. The couple eventually found their way out of the village to make their way back to the hotel in Dunster. Although they had never intended to visit the picturesque village of Bampton, they saw it as serendipitous, so the following day they decided to return to this pretty hamlet and take photos, as they were so impressed with its beauty. The following day they made their way back to the village of Bampton, but were totally shocked to see that everything had changed and looked totally different. They then drove to where they saw the beautiful flower arrangement around the wooden sign and wooden window boxes. As they reached the location, there was nothing to be seen, and there were no flowers or flower baskets whatsoever, and the sign that read Best Kept Town 1976 had simply vanished. They knew they were in the right village because all the other buildings were the same. They came to the weirdest of conclusions that it was the same village but a different time. They were now unsettled by what they'd encountered, and then had other strange thoughts and impressions from the day before, where Alf claimed that as they were looking at the map, he had inadvertently dropped his cigarette on the map and had left a burn mark. When he later checked the map, he found there was no burn hole, and for all intents and purposes the incident had never happened, and it was as if he had never dropped his cigarette. They also recall that as they were driving through the village the previous day, time appeared to stand still, and there was no sign of any people, and there was a deathly silence. When they arrived in the village, they remembered checking their watches, which showed that the time was 7:30 p.m, and as they left, they again checked their watches and found that the time was still showing 7:30 p.m. It was as if the couple had never even entered the village. Later, when they decided to seek out more information about the history of the small village, they found that it had indeed won an award for Best Kept Village. But the award was not in 1983 when they arrived, but the award for Best Kept Village was won in 1976, exactly what was written on the wooden sign. There appears no doubt that the couple had somehow entered a time slip, and for a short period of time they'd been transported back to the year 1976. Another reality. In 1934, a woman by the name of Miriam Golding had the most bizarre incident after she entered an elevator with a fiancé in Chicago. There were so many people in the elevator, and when the doors opened, Miriam had inadvertently got out at the wrong floor. But because the elevator was so crowded, she found she could not push her way back in and figured she would have to wait for the next one. But this was when things went completely awry for Miriam Golding. As she looked around, she found she was no longer in the store, but instead found herself standing at a busy railway station. But how did she get there? The railway station was abuzz with activity, with many travellers rushing to the train amid the sound of the announcements of arrivals and departures. How did this place have any connection with the store she'd just been in? And she tried to join up the dots in her head as to how she could be one moment be in a store and the next on a busy railway station. Believing there must be a simple explanation to what had just happened, she made her way to an information booth to seek further clarification as to her whereabouts, but found that the woman in the booth completely ignored her, as if she were invisible. Now totally bewildered, Miriam left the railway station, and when she got outside, found the weather mild and sunny. When she was in the store in Chicago, it was autumn, and the weather she was now observing told her it was definitely not autumn, and she quickly realised she was no longer in Chicago. Miriam walked around in a confused state, trying to get her bearings. And as she looked around, she noticed that everyone around her seemed to ignore her, as if she were not there. Just like the woman at the information booth on the station. Then she came upon a young man standing at the sidewalk, looking as confused as she was, and decided to approach him. and to her surprise found that he was able to see her, unlike everybody else around her. The young man seemed equally relieved that he was visible to Miriam and smiled, saying, "I guess you're a bit lost too." Miriam and the young man walked together down the street, bewildered by their whereabouts. The young man then told Miriam what had happened to him. He said he'd been playing tennis in Lincoln, Nebraska, and had gone to the locker room, but when he came out of the locker room, he found the tennis courts had disappeared, and in its place was a huge railway station. It was the same station that Miriam had appeared after exiting the elevator. The two kept walking until they reached the ocean, and over the waves they could just make out a sandbar where several women were sitting and casually chatting amongst themselves. Then Miriam was able to identify one of the women as being her fiancé's sister. Then the woman out on the sandbar appeared to notice Miriam and began waving and shouting to her. The young man attempted to swim out to the sandbar, which appeared to be only a short distance away. And even though he considered himself a good swimmer, no matter how hard he tried, he made no progress in reaching the sandbar and returned to the shore frustrated. But as he looked back, the sandbar suddenly vanished into thin air. Miriam then closed her eyes in exhaustion and disappointment. Now exhausted, she was suddenly overcome by the sensation of floating through space. After appearing to hover in darkness, she suddenly opened her eyes and found herself sitting on a stool in a music store back in Chicago, which seemed to be in the process of closing for the night. Miriam figured that she'd been there for at least several hours. Disoriented, Miriam looked around for her fiancé, but could not find him, and decided to head back to his home. When she arrived, her fiancé was noticeably relieved and explained that he had lost her in the store and had waited for her to come to the right floor before deciding to go home. Bizarrely, the fiancé's sister, who Miriam had seen on the mysterious sandbar, claimed that she had seen Miriam in town and had even called out to her, but figured she'd been too absorbed talking to a young man and hadn't noticed her. So where had Miriam been, and why should she see the fiancé's sister on a sandbar while the sister had seen her in town? But they could not reach across to communicate. Why did they appear to be separated by a strange barrier? And what became of the young man? Had Miriam entered into another reality or another dimension? Had Miriam simply had some sort of blackout outside of the elevator and had somehow hallucinated the strange series of events?